Well, it's very unusual. So if we trust the observations, and observations are quite short in this part of the world, we really only trust observations from the 1950s onwards. We now had a storm that reached severe categories. So these are the categories 4 and 5 this early in the season. Normally this happens much later, so end of August or mostly in September. So this is, if we trust the observations, this is really unusual. The other aspect of this is that it has reached this intensity in about a day. So it took about 42 hours to get from tropical depression all the way to this category 4. And in fact, it has intensified at a rate that is rarely seen. We've seen a few. 2015, we had Patricia on the East Pacific side do something like that, also in less than a day. And recently, we had a few in the Atlantic doing that in all the way to just 8 hours, but much, much later in the season.
What are the conditions that cause a hurricane to gather pace so quickly like this?
So hurricanes like warm ocean temperatures. So that is the first bit of the conditions we're looking for. And so that's one of the reasons why they normally form later in the season when the ocean temperatures are warmer. They also dislike the winds being very different at the surface of the planet and high up at about 10, 12 kilometers. The winds are very different. They end up being tilted. They're like bottles. They like to stand up. They don't like to be tilted over. So the conditions now are quite anomalous in that we've had very warm sea surface temperatures, particularly on the east side of the Atlantic, for over a year now. If you look at the temperature record, it is about 2 degrees warmer, consistently warmer in the last year and a half than it has been, and much warmer than many climate models had predicted they would be by this time. Some of that has to do with the El Nino, but some of that, there are speculations, has to do with the strongly reduced pollution, particularly on that side of the Atlantic. There has been much legislation going on about ships having to use much cleaner fuels, and that may have led to a more transparent atmosphere. So still a lot of debate which bit of this is prevailing, so the oceanic circulation aspects and the bit that has to do with the transparency of the atmosphere. But the heat content in the Atlantic Ocean is much, much higher than it has been, and it is definitely very high in this season. So this is something the hurricanes like, and this is how they grow, and particularly this is how they grow rapidly.
Yeah, that's fascinating about the sort of the clarity and, of the air and the lack of pollution. I hadn't heard that as a factor. You know, of course, climate change is again being blamed. Do you think this is very much part of the equation now?
So so there are some people in the community that do these attribution studies. They try to understand how much climate change is playing a role. I've asked one of my colleagues in France who does this in real time. He hasn't quite done this yet, but I can tell you that if we look at now the statistics of the climate simulations that we carry out also here at Reading, we do know that if we impose climate change in these simulations, we end up with a larger proportion of these category 4 and 5 in future climates. And so we're moving towards these future climates that we've been simulating. And so we'll have more of these very intense ones and fewer of the tropical depression, tropical storm, and category 1, 2, 3. So the things we've been seeing in the last few years are consistent with these climate scenarios that we've been studying. And the physics of it is very plausible, and the chain of events is very plausible. So we do believe that climate change plays a role. These attribution studies can quantify how much climate change is involved. It's very difficult, of course, to do it for a single episode, but that's why we study many of them, and we produce more robust statistics on these developments.
Yeah, because that sort of is really needed to back this up. When you look at the changes, what parts of the world do you think are going to be the most vulnerable?
Well, so I have performed these studies all over the world, and so risk is defined by the intersection of the hazard, in this case the tropical cyclone, the exposure, that is what's at the coastline, for instance, and the vulnerability, so how strong the infrastructure is and all that. And I can give you an example of the Philippines. We've been studying some very intense historic typhoons. The same phenomenon, it has a different name in the Pacific Ocean, but it's the same exact phenomenon. And what is happening there is also that the SSTs, so the sea surface temperatures are warming, but also the tracks are changing. And what these storms find on the ground in such places is coastline that is very much built with many, many human activities, including fishing and just people trying to make a living, with infrastructure that often is not built to withstand such strong storms. Often the funding for such things is not available, and so these coastal communities are very, very vulnerable. And if something happens in these places, in many situations, there is no insurance and there is not that much money coming from governments, so the reconstruction will take a very long time. We could say that most of these tropical regions are very vulnerable because of all these reasons, and also they will suffer the consequences for many years to come.
Pierre, fascinating. I do appreciate your expertise and giving us some greater insights. Thank you.
You're very welcome.